When you measure the wrong thing, you will create a wrong world. You will create a toxic world. So measure biodiversity. Biodiversity is what makes food. So our health per acre indicator, our wealth per acre, true cost accounting, shows that farmers who are saving their seeds and not spending scarce money on buying from Monsanto, who are using ecological inputs and not spending huge amounts of money on fertilizers and pesticides, and who are making an effort to create their markets, not trying to feed into the global supply chain. They're earning 10 times more than those who are chasing the big market.
Welcome in Pierre-Châtel, Vandana Shiva. We are pleased to welcome you in Pierre-Châtel. So I have a few questions to ask you for Nexus magazine. The first, I would like to... You have a background in physics. What led you to become an activist, an environmental activist?
Well, you know, I chose physics because I wanted to understand how the world works. And in my time, nature was understood the deepest level in physics, then derived level of chemistry, and then biology. And eventually, through my studies in particle physics, my questions on particle physics, on particles, on quantum theory grew. And finally, I went to Canada to do a PhD, even though I'd started a PhD in India, on particle physics itself. And just before I was leaving for Canada, I wanted to do a trek in the Himalaya, where I've grown up, and carry a bit of the forests with me. And the trek I went for, that forest wasn't there, and the stream that used to come from it was a trickle, because the forest was an oak forest, and been cleared for apple orchards, for commercialization, the World Bank project. And I was waiting for the bus on the road, and we had these lovely little chai shops, if you've ever been to India. And waiting for the bus, I said to the chai wala, to the dhaba wala, I said, this breaks my heart, it's like part of me is lost. Because I had never before that experienced a forest going. I'd grown up in the forest, and never seen this kind of clearing and displacement. And he said, but now there's hope, there's Chipko. This is the first time I heard about Chipko. I was going to take a flight, so I couldn't go and look for the places where Chipko action was happening. I decided that every vacation I would come back and volunteer for this movement, Chipko, which means to hug. And women of my region in the mountains had declared that we will hug the trees. You cannot destroy these forests because they protect us from landslides, they protect us from drought, they protect us from floods. And it's that volunteering that made me an activist.
Mm-hmm. What's about the beginning of the first book you wrote was The Violence of the Green Revolution. What led you to write this first book?
You know, I had studied in Punjab University. And Punjab at that time was the richest state of India, very prosperous. And in my time, they're very peaceful. I mean, I could study there. I could walk to the university from my hostel with no anxiety. And then by 84, Punjab had erupted in huge violence. And in those days, I was working for the United Nations University, which is a university in Tokyo. And I was leading a program on conflicts over natural resources as part of something bigger called Peace and Global Transformation. People were trying to keep track of the changing world of globalization, new violence, new conflicts. And I was asked to look at conflicts over resources because I'd worked with Chipko, I'd worked on issues of dams, rivers, conflicts over land, conflicts over forests. And 84 June, the army was sent to Punjab, to the sacred temple of the Sikhs, the Golden Temple. And then, of course, the vicious cycle of violence started, and it hasn't stopped. Even now, the diplomatic fights between India and Canada, India and United Kingdom are related to those events. So I had not been trained in any, social science. I'd been involved in movements as activist, and I had been trained in quantum theory. And what I'd learned in quantum theory are three things. First, there is nothing like Cartesian causality. France gave the world Descartes and all his crazy thinking. And for Descartes, everything was mechanical, linear. There was res extensa, tables that could be measured, and brilliant minds which had knowledge. Other human beings didn't have knowledge, and none of the living world had knowledge. So quantum theory teaches you there's nothing like determinate qualities that you can measure in the world of the quanta. The same entity can be a particle if you put up an apparatus to measure a particle, and if you put up an apparatus to measure a wave, you get the wave. And this is what Bohr called complementarity. So there's nothing like absolute determinate qualities. It's all indeterminate. What comes out is your relationship with what you're measuring. And the second thing in quantum theory is there's nothing like fixed inert entities in the world. Everything is potential. The only entity in the quantum system is the quantum potential, and the probability of that. So I said, okay, this place had the potential to be peaceful, and that's what I experienced.
Okay, yeah.
And it has a potential to be violent, which is what I'm witnessing. So what was the context for that peace? What's the context for this violence? And in that search, I found the Green Revolution.
Okay.
That's what had changed Punjab.
Okay.
In the 60s, it had been imported, and Punjab was where it was first experimented.
Okay.
It totally changed Punjab. It changed India.
It was introduced in 1984.
No,
the Green Revolution.
No, that's when the eruption.
No, in the 1960s. 66. Okay.
So they had been waiting.
Okay.
From the 50s.
Okay.
But they didn't find an opportunity. And the real thing about the Green Revolution was to sell chemical fertilizers.
Okay. What was the impact on farmers, on food security?
So the first thing that happened was the soil started to die.
Okay.
It requires 10 times more water when you use chemicals, something that was never told. So the water started to disappear. And there was a water famine.
So quickly?
Very quickly.
Okay.
Within less than a decade, yeah. It goes hand in hand with chemicals. New diseases started to come up. There's a cancer train that runs from Punjab because it's got very heavy use of pesticides. And farmers were in debt. Because initially, as for the European farmers, the initial stages of industrial farming is introduced with subsidies. And then at a certain point, they said, we don't need the farmers anymore. So withdraw the subsidies. It's happening now. This is why you have protests all over Europe. The protests are around free trade and subsidies, but they're made to look like a fight between environmentalists and farmers, which is totally contrived by the industry itself.
What was the impact on biodiversity of this?
There used to be 250 crop varieties that used to grow in Punjab. It was a land of millets. Their staple food was jowar and bajra, millets. Their most sophisticated cuisine is makki ki roti, which is cornbread, with mustard greens. You don't see the millets, you don't see the mustard, you don't see the corn. All you see is in one season is the dwarf wheat varieties. And this is important, I just explained it to you, because it's always said that we helped India. Even yesterday night before flying, one of our former ministers was chairing a session on food. And he said we had a ship-to-mouth existence. till the Green Revolution came. But what most people don't know is in every part of India, eats different things and grows different things. Some areas are different kinds of millet. Some are corn areas. Most of the coastal areas are wheat areas. Are rice areas. They don't. If you give them a chapati, they do not think it food. They want rice, morning, breakfast, lunch, dinner. Punjab never grew rice.
Salut tout le monde, juste pour vous dire, on a tout un article sur Vandana Shiva dans le dernier numéro, le 155, le dernier numéro de Nexus, qui est actuellement en librairie près de chez vous. Et sinon, vous pouvez le commander en ligne sur nexus.fr. On retourne sur l'entretien.
So wheat and rice were the two commodities that were being pushed. And the traditional varieties are multi-purpose varieties. They're the straw is for animals and the grain was for humans. But the problem with these tall varieties, they grow as tall as this tree. The problem was when it's that tall and you apply synthetic fertilizers, these tall varieties lodge. And lodging became a problem. So Borlaug was given the job. Borlaug, who had worked for DuPont Defense Lab and was put on this job to push more chemical fertilizers, he used Norrin wheat that was stolen by the Americans from Japan, and Rewanju rice that was stolen from Indonesia, and he crossed these short varieties with the so-called Green Revolution varieties. So all of these varieties were now short, that high. Now they say we grew more food, but all the calculations show that the food for animals disappeared. It was zero. And the food for the soil, which is the straw, disappeared. So the soil organisms were starved, animals were starved, and of course there was more commodities of rice and wheat. And the measure that was created at that time was called yield per acre. Liebig, who's the father of modern organic farming, and I wrote a foreword in English to the English edition, which has just been published.
When was it?
The original book, In Search for Recycling, was done in 1880, but the English was done by, I think, some Dutch scientist about 2 years ago. And they asked me to do the foreword. So I read it, and he said, I promoted the nitrogen cycle, I promoted the nutrients, but I didn't promote commercialization and external inputs. I didn't promote an industry. And I thought it wasn't enough as a scientist to do good work. I now realize a good scientist has a second job, to pull down the altars of falsehoods that use our knowledge to turn it into profit. And I saw it when I did the Punjab study, and I said, this is not measuring how much food you're growing, because the food for the cows and the food for the earthworms disappeared. It's not measuring the quality of the food, because all the Green Revolution varieties, all industrial varieties, are 80% less nutritive. Because the soil has no nutrition.
So much.
70 to 80%. And we've done these studies now. But globally they are available. So doesn't measure the quality of food, how much nutrition you have. It doesn't measure how well did the farmer do. Because farmers of Punjab were rising. I said, they're not telling the story of the farmer. So it's not telling you the story of the farm. They're not telling you the health of the soil. Because farmers were complaining about the death of the soil. So I said, no, we will create an indicator that takes the health, the health of the soil, the biodiversity of the farm, the economics of the farmer, how well are they doing, and the quality of food. So we created an indicator called health per acre. And we can feed 2 times the world's population by intensifying biodiversity, not chemicals.
When did you build up the organic movement in India, and why? What inspired you to begin them?
Well, in '84 itself, I saw this as a violent agriculture. And that same year later, in the city of Bhopal, a pesticide plant leaked and killed hundreds of thousands.
hundreds of thousands, so many.
Yeah, there were mountains of dead bodies in Bhopal. And they used to say pesticides are safe. And in the third world, definitely in India, in the local languages, they call it the medicine for the plants. They don't call it poison, which it is.
Mm-hmm.
So I saw the origins of this violence, and I identified it in Hitler's Germany. IG Farben, the poison gases that were used to kill the French troops in the First World War. I think the First World War, yeah. Mm-hmm. And to gas the people in the concentration camps. These are all ancestors of pesticides. The same technology then gave us other pesticides. So I took a pledge that this is agriculture like war. I will look for agriculture practices that are non-violent. Ahimsa, Gandhi's word of ahimsa, mm-hmm. non-violent. And I started then to study how Indian farmers practiced. I read Albert Howard, who did his book on the Agriculture Testament, based on learning from Indian farmers. He was sent to improve Indian farming by the British, but he found the soils are fertile. And there are lots of insects but no pests. So he said, I'll make the pest and the peasant my professors. And he wrote the book called Agriculture Testament. And that same year, 5, 6 of us who were concerned about chemical agriculture and monocultures got together and created a network, which we call Samvardhan, balance. And we launched the organic movement in 84, same year. And okay. After that, of course, I turned more to practice. I was put on the standards body of the country. But my work on biodiversity and agriculture has always combined activism and practice, activism of resistance, but the practice of the creative work. Mm-hmm. How do you actually protect biodiversity? How do you save seeds? And on the other hand, constantly watching the next step. Because they first did the Green Revolution. Then they brought the GMOs, they called it the second Green Revolution. And now they're bringing digital agriculture, which I call the third Green Revolution, based on fourth industrial revolution, as the World Economic Forum says.
Mm-hmm. I've understood that you've built up your Navdanya in 40 years ago, almost?
Yeah.
Yes.
It's very interesting. You know, I'm here in France. I guess about 50 miles from here is a little village called Beaugèvre. I'd written my book on the Green Revolution, and because of that, I started to get invited. And this conference was a conference in Geneva at the United Nations and here in Beaugèvre, in a retreat center. And the conference was on the new biotechnologies. The title of the conference was Laws of Life. What are the laws of life? Industry was trying to think that laws of life are to make GMOs. And we were looking at what really are the laws of life. You know, I was trained in physics, but I hadn't attended one class of biology because they were chopping up cockroaches. I said, this is not the field I want to study. But later, when the challenge is all focused on biology, I taught myself, yeah, agriculture is a biological process. So I learned more and more. And so 1987 is this conference of Beaugèvre. And the industry says 3 things that shake me up totally. If the Green Revolution Punjab disaster hadn't shaken me up, you know, I needed just a little more. And they said, we are too small and too poor. We've got to get bigger. And by the turn of the century, which they will refer to as 2000, we will be 4 companies controlling seed and food. And sure enough, 4 corporations, chemical corporations, now control 60% of the commercial seeds in the world. The second thing they said is, it's not fair that farmers save seeds. So it must be made illegal. And that's why we must write an international treaty, which they were referring to as is the Intellectual Property Treaty of GATT and WTO, which is why I got involved in GATT and WTO. And I realized we have to save seeds. So they wanted to make seed saving illegal. They wanted a monopoly. very consciously, and they wanted to create this new kind of property, intellectual property. Now, someone like me who, you know, I do think about things, yeah, I say, you are corporations, you're not people. You're pieces of paper. And you're talking about property in the mind. You don't have a mind. Real people have bodies and minds. You don't have a mind. And second, when you take the seeds from our peasants and shoot one gene into it, that's not creation of life. Life is creating itself. Fortunately, all these arguments have now worked in many court cases in India. And I also worked, we had a parliament and a government that listened, debated. We wrote a law, two very powerful laws, and I was involved in both. One is on the amendment in the patent law, and our amendment says plants, animals, and seeds are not human inventions. Therefore, they cannot be patented. Therefore, in seeds, there can be no patent. And the other is I should keep on saying the first breeders are farmers. All the seed comes from farmers. Their manipulation is one gene, one toxic gene, a Bt gene or a Roundup Ready gene. The seed itself comes from nature and our ancestors who have bred all this diversity. So then I started, I said, I got off the flight and hand over the dam work, handed over forest work to younger activists. I said, now I'll first learn about seed and I'll save seeds. It had to be a lot of fresh thinking. So I created community seed banks because one challenge is to be able to recover the imagination of the commons. Mm-hmm. Because intellectual property on seed is an enclosure of the commons. So we created community seed bank. And since that time, the work, you know, it's concrete work. Seeds we had saved in Orissa have helped farmers respond to 3 times. You know, one was the super cyclone, but now we've had another cyclone, but we've saved the salt-tolerant seeds. We gifted salt-tolerant seeds to the peasants after the tsunami. And, you know, people treat seed saving as a museum activity. For me, it's defense of life in its integrity and diversity.
Okay. If you had to review these 40 years of Vandana activity, what will be the main achievements?
Well, the main achievement is I think we've created more than 170 community seed banks. Some have much larger connections, some have less connections. So farmers have access to seed. There's a storm, there's a flood. They don't get into a new debt, getting hybrid GMOs. They exchange between themselves. We've saved 4,000 varieties of rice. We've saved about 300 kinds of wheats that are all don't contribute to gluten tolerance. They are all, and in fact, Monsanto patented one of our wheats. And I had to fight them. I mean, I've come to Munich many times to fight biopiracy, the neem, the wheat, basmati, for which my valley is famous, the aromatic rice. We reclaimed all the pulses because the British didn't know how to use plant proteins. They knew animal proteins. So they named our pulses cowpea, horse gram, you know, chickpea, everything was an animal food. Most importantly, when I started to save seeds, and I'd go to the villages, and I'd see these millets growing, and I'd talk to the women, and women say, we have strength because we eat millets. You know, our men go after the white rice, and they have no strength. So I started to study the millets. We started to save the seeds of millets. And from 87 onwards, we promoted millets. Last year was declared the UN year of millets. So I think these are some of the quantifiable impact, but I think we shifted the paradigm of agriculture in 3 ways. We said, you're counting the wrong thing. Because what you think of the world is what you measure. When you measure the wrong thing, you will create a wrong world. You will create a toxic world. So measure biodiversity. Biodiversity is what makes food. So our health per acre indicator, our wealth per acre, true cost accounting, shows that farmers who are saving their seeds and not spending scarce money on buying from Monsanto, who are using ecological inputs and not spending huge amounts of money on fertilizers and pesticides, and who are making an effort to create their markets, not trying to feed into the global supply chain. They're earning 10 times more than those who are chasing the big market.
Okay.
By creating local markets, seed sovereignty, food sovereignty.
What's about women in those fights? Are the women in the forefront of those fights for biodiversity?
Yes, very much.
Yeah.
When I started, I just started with the community. And very often, when the meetings would be there, the men would talk a lot. But the next time I visited the same village, the women had saved the seeds and had the knowledge of it. And the men were still giving the same speech. So over time, I said, women have been the evolvers of seed, women have been the carers of seed. Women are basically run the food economy. As farmers of the South, as growers of food, but around the world, if you really take the proportion of time that is spent, women's time is the maximum time. And for sure, particularly in the South, women are in the forefront of a shift from monocultures to biodiversity, from toxic chemicals to internal inputs, from distant commodity markets to local exchange. I'll give you two examples of this. So in the very early days, I used to encourage farmers to save their own seeds. At that time, I hadn't told them to make community seed banks. And, in our mountains, it's like this. At the bottom is the shop and the commercial center, and the men are sitting there and smoking and playing cards. And I say, in your village, are you growing this? Because I carry my parents' books. Only they had all these old crops. No, we stopped growing all that. Now we grow potato and soya bean. Those are cash crops. And I'd keep climbing, and just like this monastery is on the top of the hill, I'd keep climbing and go to the village where women were growing the food, taking care of it. And I'd ask them, do you have all this? Of course we do. Our kids would starve if we didn't grow all this. The potatoes and soya for the market is not what feeds us.
Mm-hmm.
So the economy itself, the perception of what is the economy is different. Women work for sustenance of the earth and their families and community. And the men have been very distracted by the market.
I saw that you won the Nobel Prize, the Alternative Nobel Prize in 1993.
Yes.
What did it change for you?
Well, I think the two things it changed for me is, of course, it brought me award money, and that always helped. But most important is, it created a very strong community of earth warriors. Because everyone who gets that award gets it for working against abuse and injustice, for protection of the earth and people's rights. And this is a wonderful network. And that community, having that community, is for me the most special gift of receiving that prize.
Schumacher wrote a book in 1973, Small is Beautiful. How do you understand that this message was almost ignored?
Well, not only was the message ignored, even though it's the most important message, and I'll come to why it's important, but the ashram, because he wrote the book in an Indian ashram, a Gandhi ashram, in Banaras. Last year it was bulldozed, where he wrote the book. In the middle of the night, place was bulldozed because current government wants that land for malls and cinema halls. why is this book so important and why was it ignored? It's ignored because industrialism is based on size. Instead of 100 artisans weaving in their homes, one factory in Manchester. And this celebration of bigness, of scale, also does the obverse. You know, it hides more production in a decentralized way in the small. So small is beautiful was making us open eyes to the real economy. Nature doesn't conserve water with one large dam. For nature, every root of every tree is a dam. The soil with organic matter is a dam. For indigenous people, they create hundreds of ways to conserve water. And those systems, even today, work much more effectively than the large. So this addiction to concentration, centralization, commercialization required making the small invisible. The same is the argument today. Why are they attacking the farmers? Because they want small farmers to disappear. And they want more and more large farms, not growing food. Large farms have never grown food. 80% of the food grown in the world that we eat comes from small farms. The rest produces commodities. 90% of the corn and soya that's grown today is not feeding people. It's feeding cars and factory animals. It's factory food. It's factory feed and biofuel. So the struggles of European peasants right now is actually defense of the small. And in fact, Schumacher's book, Small is Beautiful, should become, how do we create a future that's livable, not only for the earth, but for people everywhere? Because what's happening is as the small disappears, livelihoods disappear, employment disappears, hope disappears, the subject of my talk tomorrow. And everyone falls into hopelessness because their space of making meaning has been robbed.
Gandhi spoke about his economic principles a long time ago. What's about those economic principles nowadays? Are they still relevant?
Well, you know, when I heard the chemical industry, the big giants, in the Bourgeois meeting of 1987, talking about controlling the seed, and on the flight back, I kept thinking, with my knowledge and experience of the Green Revolution, my mind went back to Gandhi's struggles. And I drew on my big register. First industrial revolution was around industrialization of cotton. It was an empire of cotton. And what did Gandhi pull out? A spinning wheel. He didn't know how to spin. He found an old woman who could teach him. And he brought spinning into the national thinking. He said, as long as we buy cloth from the imperialists, we will be colonized. The day we start making our own cloth, we will be free. I then started to think, so what's the spinning wheel of today? So I made another column. I made the second column, the chemical industry. There was no movement at the time when they introduced it. Rachel Carson wrote a book, Silent Spring. But the kind of movements that are now growing on toxics, they weren't there then. And then the meeting I was at was called the Life Sciences meeting, you know, laws of life. So I said, what is the raw material? At that time it was cotton. And what is the alternative? For Gandhi, the alternative to the Manchester and Lancashire factories was the spinning wheels in every home in India. So I said, the raw material is seed. That's what they take from our farmers. What's the resistance? Seed itself. save the seeds so there are alternatives. So 3 principles Gandhi gave us, which I've put fully to use to organize the movement for seed sovereignty and food sovereignty. The first is self-organization. He called it Swaraj, which also means self-determination. Swadeshi, making yourself, not depending on others. And the third, which is most important, Satyagraha, the fight for truth. So we are fighting for the truth of seed. We are fighting for the truth of knowledge of our people. And the empire today is a knowledge empire. It's a food empire. It's a seed empire. And right now, if you watch, there's this desperate attempt to wipe out everything living, the cows, the chicken, for fake food, you know? Just like chemical food was made to look like the only way we feed ourselves, and organic as an option was destroyed, right now there's attempts to make fake food and make it look it's the only solution to climate change, when it is not. It increases emissions 25 times more. So, you know, for me, my lifetime's work has been always defense for nature, because I love nature. Fight for justice, because I really do believe that injustice has no place in our society, and a fight against untruth. You know, that's the scientist in me. When I can see this doesn't add up, the green revolution did not add up in producing more food. The GMOs did not add up. Fake food as a climate solution. My next book is on, it's called Nature of Nature, the metabolic disorder of climate change. That the earth is living, and this is a metabolic disorder, just like the chronic diseases, the diabetes and everything else, are metabolic disorders of human beings. But we have to stop treating the earth as inert and dead and raw material. The earth is living.
We saw there are more and more free trade agreements. What are the links between the industrial agriculture on those free trade agreements? What are the links?
Well, if you look at the GATT and WTO, I got into it because of the Monsanto's talking about, you know, the monopoly on seed coming through the intellectual property rights of the WTO. And when my government said, but intellectual property is a national subject, you cannot put it into trade treaty. The US lawyers just went back to Washington and put TR before IP, trade related. Now it's trade related by definition. The second treaty is the Agriculture Trade Treaty, Agriculture Agreement, written by Cargill. So the seed treaty and intellectual property was written by Monsanto. The trade was written by Cargill, and it combines the fact that continuing to use subsidies of very large kind, they then dump artificially cheap products and destroy the agriculture. So everyone is crying about new hunger in Africa. No one is talking about the fact that before globalization, most countries of Africa produce their own food. It's this globalization. And the third is junk food, the Treaty on Sanitary and Phytosanitary Agreements, which sounds very sophisticated. The name is so confusing, but it basically means the junk food industry, the Cokes, Pepsi, and the Nestle's, write the laws for safety and dump. Just look at the data on how junk food has spread all over the world. So what was in WTO is being reproduced in every bilateral, regional treaty. Same things. Issues are the same, because every free trade agreement is driven by the corporations, and all governments work under their pressure, even though it is against their country to sign it.
What about Mexico? There was a free trade agreement in 1994, and after
NAFTA.
Okay.
The North American Free Trade Agreement.
And after there has been a rise of violence, drugs. Are there links between this rise of violence?
Huge link. Because I've been working with Mexican farmers and the Mexican government even before that time. And And they've been trying to ban GMO corn for very long. Many of my friends have done studies on the contamination of corn, and Mexico is the home of corn diversity. Yeah? I remember I was invited to a public hearing in Oaxaca, and people were talking about the impact of this free trade agreement. And there was an economist who put out the data that it wiped out half of the economy of Mexico, both because land that was held collectively was turned into private property, and the corporations started to buy it, so people became landless. Second was, of course, subsidized corn started to get dumped, and the junk food started to come. It's one of the biggest consumers of junk food, Mexico. And this economist said something that I have cited in India. He said, when you destroy honest livelihoods of hardworking people, you will create the drug crisis, the disappearances, because that's another problem in Mexico, and the sex trade. And he says 1/3 of our economy today is these three things.
Mm-hmm.
So it is free trade. And free trade for me is freedom for corporations and unfreedom for people.
Why are the billionaires of the Silicon Valley so keen on transhumanism?
For two reasons. The first is they have never related to society at the human level. And anyone who is deeply human will want to deepen their humanity. They will not want humanity to disappear and become part of a machine. So it's their existing in humanity and the existing callousness and carelessness and indifference to fellow human beings. That's one driver. They wouldn't even be doing what they're doing. Forget the future transhumanism. The kind of profiteering they're doing. Just look at three things. Look at the data that's coming out on how the tech giants were very, very active in the censorship about people's health. There's enough that's coming out now. And the cases that are getting lost. The second part of it is the first free trade meeting of WTO was in Singapore. And Gates manipulated that meeting to say, information is a different thing, you know, it's not like this recorder, so you make it tax-free. Now, can you imagine? They shifted their software jobs to India. At that time, I'm talking about 96, they saved annually 40 billion because they were paying the Indians 1/10 of what they would pay the same Indian if the Indian migrated to Silicon Valley. Yeah? They're not paying any taxes. On top of that, people like Bill Gates have become philanthrocapitalists. They're taxed for more tax states. I have a book they've got out there called Oneness versus 1%, which has been published in France. So, besides the fact that they are inhuman anyway, and they want to run away from any responsibility that being human brings. Being human brings responsibilities to the earth, responsibilities to each other, and out of those duties flow our rights. Human rights flow from human duties, but they've never practiced human duties, and they wanted absolute in human rights. But the second is, they're all Descartes addicts. They feel that the reality is what Descartes constructed, that the mind is separate from the body, that they are today's Descartes of minds without body. What did Descartes say? I'm a thinking thing without a body. They think they're thinking things without. The arrogance, they don't realize they have become super rich and billionaires by not paying their due to society and creating monopolies through software and patents. That's where the wealth comes from. Instead of recognizing that the flow comes from injustice, they think that same brilliance is in their heads and everyone else is inferior. I remember Zuckerberg gave a speech at Harvard. He said 99% of the people will be useless in the future. He said it in Harvard. And this Yuval Harari says it every day at the World Economic Forum. Yeah? So not only do they not want to pay their dues, not only do they not want to recognize that what they have comes from society, every profit comes from a young university student who's paying them royalties. They don't see that. Just like people didn't see the peasant as creating the real wealth. And not the bourgeois elite, which is why you had the French Revolution. We need a French Revolution on Silicon Valley. But it's partly denialism and partly arrogance. And a totally outmoded paradigm of division and separation is what they would like to make permanent through their surveillance systems, through using governments to implement their agendas. And that's why freedom from the dependency on these tech giants is the way we realize freedom from the poison giants was necessary for having seed freedom. Freedom from tech giants is vital for humanity's freedom for the future. We have to do creative things. Use it. Use a gadget. Make a phone call. Record. But do it minimally, never with a dependence.
We see a quick rise of artificial intelligence since a few years. What do you think about this quick rise of IA?
Well, in fact, the New York Times that I was reading on the flight says AI has discovered a huge deposit of copper in Zambia, multinational, which is already there. And AI has discovered the extra deposit right in the same land. So the company is already there. The company could have just drilled deeper, and the mystification, the same mystification that's been done, that large is more productive and small is not, therefore deny small is beautiful, the same denial that makes us think small farmers should disappear and we can eat fake food, the same denial is mixing up multiple forms of intelligence. Intelligence in the street. I mean, this plant could not grow if it was not intelligent. One of the founders of electromagnetism was J.C. Bose, an Indian scientist. He applied his electromagnetism to proving that plants are sentient. They have feeling. So he used his electromagnetic radiation. So if you hurt the plant, how does the plant respond? He did this nearly a century ago. You know? So these are living systems. And wherever there's life, there's intelligence. Because wherever there's life, options have to be made. Even a bacteria. Why are bacteria having antibiotic resistance? Because we've bombarded so much antibiotics that the bacteria has responded with intelligence by developing resistance. Or why are the weeds in America developing resistance to glyphosate? Because those plants are intelligent. Intelligent comes from the Latin root intellegere, the ability to choose this part of this. Every leaf decides which way it's going to grow. Every bacteria decides. So artificial intelligence is like the civilizing mission of those tech barons. Just like in colonial times, our people were massacred. Indigenous people of Americas were massacred. The Africans were massacred. The French colonialism of West Africa, people are still reacting. I know the 3 or 4 countries have just said we are not part of that old former colonial system, because all the gold moves here. And they live in poverty. So this is the new colonialism. And basically to say there's no intelligence outside artificial. Why is that so wrong? Because all artificial intelligence is taking lots and lots and lots of data. But the data that can be harvested is the left brain activity of humans. Whatever we can, the analytic part. And that gets downloaded into computers. And lots of data, 100,000 data sets are then analyzed. And that is then shown as artificial intelligence. But all the same, the raw material is all human brain power, but partial human brain power. It doesn't have the right brain activity of synthesizing, of value judgment, what's right and wrong, what's ethical and what's not ethical. So it's basically the ultimate Cartesian ideal of trying to get rid of all relationship, trying to get rid of the sentience of life on earth, and the multiple intelligences we have, emotional intelligence, cooperative intelligence, to be able to sit together and compassionate intelligence. The intelligence of being able to feel care and respond to injustice. To me, that's very high level intelligence. And they'd like to wipe it all out and say, this is all that matters. And it's like a self-fulfilling prophecy. You just say it every time. You teach it to every kid in nursery. By the end of it, we'll have a group of illiterates who don't know how to think, who know how to depend on a gadget.
What is your driving force? Where is your strength coming from?
One, that I just don't like anyone trying to bully me or tell me what to do. I am absolutely intolerant to untruth, parading as science. I'm so deeply committed to real science, the real seeking, or the way things work. A rich billionaire just saying, trees do not absorb carbon dioxide. Idiots think that way. It's these big carbon capture plants that are the solution, in which I'm investing, Mr. Bill Gates. Or cows are the biggest problem. Well, if we didn't have cows on the Navdanya farm, we couldn't do organic farming. Because you can either recycle plant matter and animal waste, or you can have synthetic fertilizers. Yeah? So if you try and get out of life cycles, then you have to depend on the synthetic inputs. And the third is I so love the beauty of every plant growing, the power of nature, and I will pour myself in its defense.
Is your action rooted in spirituality? Is your action, your work, rooted in religion or spirituality?
Spirituality? I grew up in a deeply spiritual environment. Not only because real India is not the fake India, we've got lots of fake gurus, but also the basic Indian culture, which sees the earth as living, which sees us as one earth family. And, when I worked with our parliament to say seeds cannot be patented, because seeds and plants are our relatives, I was working from the spirituality of us being linked to a living system, that you have to have respect and reverence for all life on earth. My work on biodiversity is inspired by that. The respect for the intrinsic worth and self-organization of the tiniest of living beings on this planet. That's the spiritual recognition. And now the latest is the billionaires will never have enough. And they want to further, on the one hand, there's this further distraction with artificial intelligence. And the other is the distraction with financialization, having totally robbed societies of all the resources and robbing the earth of all the resources, they're now talking about financializing biodiversity. That life has no value of itself. And they're talking about financializing nature, and these tricks are carrying on. $4,000 trillion is what they're hoping to make. By shifting the value of this beautiful white rose for what it gives us, the smell, the beauty, and shift it into a financial asset that gets traded on Wall Street. And of course, you can make a disappearing river be traded 500 times. And there'll be no water, but there'll be lots of assets for the billionaires. So we're living through terribly confusing times in the hands of the few people who've made the mess on this planet. And we cannot leave it to them to shape our future.
Okay, maybe a last word. You will talk tomorrow in front of French people in Pierre-Châtel here. What will you speak about? What you'd...
Well, you know, I think 2-3 years ago they tried to get me, but it didn't work out. The time didn't work out. And that time it was about taking, you know, re-immersing in reality, because issues of artificial intelligence escape from reality. But this year they gave the theme on cultivating hope. And they gave a whole day, you know. So what I've decided to do is in the morning, I will talk about my philosophical evolution that creates space for hope. But afternoon, I will share my practice that has actually cultivated hope in absolutely dismal circumstances.
Thank you very much, Vandana Shiva. Thank you.
Thank you.
Merci d'avoir regardé l'entretien. Vous pouvez retrouver tout un article de Vandana Shiva dans le dernier numéro, le 155 de Nexus, le numéro que vous pouvez retrouver en kiosque, en librairie ou sinon sur nexus.fr, vous pouvez le commander, il arrive directement chez vous. Merci encore et à bientôt sur Nexus.